Hey folks, welcome to a brand new episode of We Talk Cyber with Monica, your one and only platform for real world stories from the renowned global experts making an impact every single day within security, privacy, and leadership. So if you wish to hear these stories directly from the source and learn and understand what does it take to build a personal success story, what are some of the biggest challenges that we're seeing within security, privacy, and leadership, and what can we do about them? And more importantly, how can you build your cybersecurity career even stronger, break into leadership, and take it a step further? And this podcast is the right place for you. So before we hop into the episode, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, Monica Talk Cyber. You'll find all my videos there, including my podcast videos. And if you want to listen to podcast audio, then please tune in and subscribe to We Talk Cyber in your favorite podcast app. Do it right away so you don't miss any of these amazing stories and conversations. So let's hop right in the episode. This is We Talk Cyber with Monica. In today's episode, we'll be talking to an industry leader within cyber threat intelligence. We'll be talking to Katie Nichols on what is cyber threat intelligence and why should organizations care about it? What role does human aspect play within threat intelligence? Has the cyber threat landscape really changed within the last decade? Why do we need to understand the threat intel part of it? What are some of the trends that we've seen recently within the threat landscape in the last years and some trends going forward? What are some of the security and privacy challenges that we face with regards to both gathering and using threat intel, and also some of the benefits? So if you want to hear about all these and more within threat intelligence, let's meet our guest right away. This is We Talk Cyber with Monica. Hi Katie, how are you doing? Welcome to the show today.
Hi Monica, thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to chat with you today.
Lovely. Let's just hop right into it. Would you like to say a few words about yourself, what you do, and maybe share a fun fact with the audience?
I'd be happy to. So I like to share my story a little bit because I think that sometimes people think that there are only people from computer science backgrounds in cybersecurity, which that is not my background at all. I went to a liberal arts school. My fun fact
Oh,
is that I went to a women's college. It's kind of rare nowadays, so kind of an interesting fact about me, especially because we work in such a male-dominated industry. But I went to a women's college and wanted to go into journalism, but that didn't work out. And luckily, I met my now husband, who said you might enjoy intelligence analysis. A lot of the same things that you do in journalism, research and writing and thinking. Actually, you do an intelligence analysis. And so I started applying for jobs and got hired by the US Department of Defense over a decade ago and found that I actually really love cybersecurity. I love the human aspect of it, though. I like, not just the code, but tracking the humans behind the keyboard. And for me, that was how cyber threat intelligence just became a perfect fit. And so from there, kind of continued my career with different contractors for the government, landed in the right place at the right time with MITRE ATT&CK previously, and then I was ready for a change. And so currently I'm the director of intelligence at Red Canary, where I get to look at a whole bunch of different threats. We do managed detection and response, so I get to see threats in different environments, and I'm just loving it. And on the side, I should mention that I also teach for the SANS Institute, their cyber threat intelligence course. So this is my passion. This is what I do.
fantastic. That is so wonderful. And I feel like actually finally finding passion in what you do and your daily work is just so important, and it has become even more important in today's world. So lovely, lovely. I think I can say it for everyone, every woman in the industry who is a part of it and who is joining and who is struggling but also then enjoying and doing the part with passion. Nothing can be better than that.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, the passion is what, keeps me going through long days and tough incidents. It's interesting because I started in government service and I was concerned about moving to private sector. And I was like, would I feel that same sense of mission? But I really do, because, private industry is part of the sector too. And vendors like Red Canary are awesome ones like FireEye and CrowdStrike, so many others. protect businesses, and that's important too. So it's been fun to continue that mission in a different way.
Right. And talking about protecting businesses, so let's hop right into the episode. What is cyber threat intelligence, for just to explain for our audience, and why should companies really care about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because so many people misunderstand what cyber threat intelligence is. They think it's either an indicator feed of IPs, or the other side of the spectrum, they think it's all about state-sponsored advanced persistent threats. But cyber threat intel, or CTI, is so much broader than that. It's really all about empowering decision makers, defenders, leadership with actionable insights about what adversaries are doing. And so that can take so many different forms. One way that cyber threat intelligence can be so helpful is by helping organizations prioritize the threats that really matter to them, because there are so many malware families and groups and adversaries out there that by focusing on, hey, these are the threats that are likely to target us or that have targeted us in the past, cyber threat intelligence analysts can help defenders go from a state of being completely overwhelmed to really focusing on what matters.
And I feel like one of the questions that I keep on getting asked by a lot of people who don't really understand cybersecurity at a technical level or don't understand threat intelligence, has the cyber threat landscape really changed over the last decade? Because the thing is, even though the different malware classes and different types of attacks, ultimately the cyber criminals and the non-ethical hackers and the attackers, they use the least and the easiest method basically to attack an organization or a business. And if you look at the last 10 years, I mean, obviously we have seen certain evolution in the threat landscape, but it's not like they have stopped using the attack vectors that they've used before. So what would you recommend, or what would you say to those people? Why do we need to really understand the threat intelligence part of it then?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point. And I absolutely agree that there's a lot that hasn't changed. And it's fascinating because, we're how many decades into this industry and we're still telling people to patch, right? Patching is always going to be a good way to protect against all threats. But I think what we've seen over the past 10 years as the community and the CTI community has advanced is that we're realizing that there are so many different threats out there. And so I hear from a lot of analysts and leaders throughout this community who are just overwhelmed by all of the blog posts, all of the tweets, all of the social media content, all of the reports from government and private sector about so many different threats. And given that we're in kind of this wealth of knowledge that's out there about threats, we have to prioritize it somehow. Back to my first point about the point of CTI. And so I would say that, especially now, when we have so much more information about threats, in one way, that's a good thing because we can better protect ourselves. But in another way, we kind of need a guiding light to, harvest through all this information that's being thrown at us. So I think that's where CTI can help quite a bit. And the other thing I would say is that while some trends haven't really changed, adversaries still use email and web to get in, there are other trends that we're seeing. And of course, some of these more advanced techniques are sometimes edge cases where adversaries are particularly advanced, exploiting a new technique from researchers like the recent one, herpaderping. But keeping an eye on what adversaries are doing, what cutting edge red teams are doing is really important, especially for protecting against really advanced adversaries, though a lot of the adversaries most orgs face are not going to be that advanced.
Right. And can you mention some of these trends that you have seen in the last years? What has evolved a bit in the last years, and what trends have you seen?
Yeah, I think one big trend is that with users and environments moving to the cloud, adversaries are too. And this is one that worries me a little bit because a lot of organizations are moving to the cloud, justifiably so, a lot of benefits there, but they're doing that without understanding kind of the shared service model with a cloud provider, who monitors what, who tracks what. And so I think some of those misunderstandings and gaps are giving opportunities for adversaries to create additional attack surface, right? Try additional attack vectors. For example, something that organizations need to know about is something called OAuth, which is basically, you click, you're in Google or you're in Microsoft, and you click on a link in an email and it says, allow this application to use your account on your behalf. You click OK. What's OAuth that's doing that behind the scenes? And the challenge is that that's a newish technique. I love it because it's, prevents me from having to remember another password and username, put that in my password manager. But adversaries are doing this too. So they're creating malicious applications, and users are just consenting to allow those malicious applications permissions to their accounts. And so that kind of thing can be really tough for organizations to identify if they don't have the right logging and visibility setup. So I would say cloud is one trend for the environments and adversaries. And then the other big one, of course, we have to talk about is ransomware.
Right.
It's fascinating because it's just skyrocketed throughout 2020 and into 2021. Ransomware has just hit almost every sector of every country. And we talk about prioritizing threats, and sometimes threats are not evenly distributed. They might target a certain sector or type of organization, but I would say ransomware is one that affects almost every organization or has the potential to affect almost every organization. And it's been overwhelming from a CTI perspective because almost every day there's a new ransomware operator popping up, a new family. And my real concern about that is that I don't see it going away anytime soon because it's just so profitable. And I don't blame victims for paying because they're in such a tough spot. But I think it's going to take a lot of really smart, creative people around the world working together to figure out a solution to ransomware.
Right. And I think one of the things that I've also noticed in the last years, and I would like to hear your thoughts on it, is that you talked a bit about that as companies and organizations are moving to cloud, so are the attackers. But I also feel like because of everybody moving into cloud or digitalizing, the supply chains are becoming more complex. So now the attackers don't necessarily just attack the organization directly, but they go and attack the service provider, which provides services to multiple organizations at the same time. So through the complex supply chains now they're a part of multiple organizations globally. When they attack there, they basically can provide damage at a much more global level. Like if you look at Cloud Hopper or what happened with Wipro or with Cognizant. And I feel like that's one of the trends will also increase. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Cloud Hopper. Some organizations track them as APT10 because that's a good example from recent years. I think that it's essential for any organization when they're thinking about threat modeling, right? Matching up the threats they care about to their organization and their assets. They need to think about those third-party suppliers or third-party organizations that access their networks and really have a deep understanding of what are those connections like. I think the reality is those are necessary, but minimizing privileges for those services that connect in, at least understanding what organizations have connections into your network is absolutely essential as you're doing threat modeling. And I suspect, as we've seen a lot of breaches involving those third-party compromises. You mentioned, Cloud Hopper, compromising managed security service providers, and then using that access to pivot into their ultimate targets. And that's another one I don't see going away anytime soon, but my hope is that as these breaches become more widely known and widely reported on, and I think that's where CTI has a role in this, organizations realize, hey, this threat is out there. And so how do we protect ourselves so we don't become the next victim of Cloud Hopper?
Absolutely. And I feel like after talking a bit about benefits of the CTI, it's kind of natural to go into some of the challenges. I would assume there's certain challenges obviously that come along with it. One of them being data quality, because obviously you said there's a lot of information out there, and information, which of that is actually intelligence, and which of that is what is important for you and your organization. Filtering through that, what kind of data quality sets there are, and so on. And the other aspect maybe also, are there like some legal and privacy challenges as well because of the amount of sensitivity into this kind of data? Can you mention some of the challenges that you've seen around these?
Yeah, absolutely. Quite a few challenges in CTI. The data quality issue is an important one. And I think it's important to draw the distinction between data, information, and intelligence, because intelligence analysts really have to take data or information, raw information that's out there and all these sources we talked about, and make sense of it, vet it, validate it, compare data that might differ from each other, right? A lot of times CTI analysts have to make sense of information that contradicts itself, which is a challenge. And so data quality is an issue, but that's where, I firmly believe that CTI is always going to be a human discipline. Intelligence is inherently done by humans. And we have tools and automation that can help us sort through data, but ultimately a human needs to make that decision on, is this data valid? What evidence do I have that supports my assessment? And so data quality is certainly an ongoing issue, and dealing with disinformation adds another level of complexity. But that's why I think analysts are so important, that human judgment. The other challenge you mentioned in terms of privacy regulations, it's such a balance in this community, right? The balance between security and privacy. And, I think that sometimes we get too far one way or the other, but it has to be a balance. And in recent years, I know that certain privacy regulations like GDPR have caused some challenges for CTI analysts. For example, who is data, registrant data, used to be a great source for CTI analysts, where you could look up who's the registrant name. And now, so commonly, if you look in a domain pivoting tool, it says GDPR protected, privacy protected. And on one hand, as a CTI analyst, that's tough and it's frustrating and you want to yell at GDPR. But on the other hand, you know what? We just have to innovate. We have to get better. We have to use different sources than we're used to. Maybe looking at TLS certificate pivoting or different sources than who is. So I think that, overall, globally for humans, I think privacy is a good thing. And I think we just have to, as a security community, be cognizant of that and cognizant of that balance. And as CTI analysts, things are going to change. Information will dry up. And as we do that, we just have to shift and try new things.
And you talk a bit about the different threat intelligence sources, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that. What would be some of the key or critical threat intelligence sources that I would recommend to the audience?
Yeah, there are so many different sources, and it sounds silly, but the first one I'll recommend is Twitter. There are so many researchers out there, the malware hunter team, who are daily reviewing malware families and activity from around the world. And they are freely sharing that on Twitter. So just following people like the malware hunter team, so many other researchers, getting to know hashtags like hashtag bizarre loader, a malware family that has led to Ryuk ransomware before, and tracking that. And as you start to track, these researchers on Twitter, you can also form relationships. And I think that that is one of the most important things in CTI and in cybersecurity, is forming relationships with other researchers. Because as you do that, you start to realize that, wow, we're all seeing very similar things and we can share our insights with each other. So Twitter and other researchers, I would say this sharing community that we have, throughout the world is absolutely top. I also recommend any CTI analyst set up some kind of RSS feed to bring in lots of different blog posts. On my personal blog, I have a starter list, different vendors, different researchers, because again, there's so much out there that's open source. So many websites maintained by researchers like Brad Duncan, he's malware traffic on Twitter, he just uploads packet capture and freely shares information. And so, of course, there are commercial CTI sources, but especially if someone's getting started in this field or you have a small team and maybe not a huge budget, I think starting with open source data and information is a good starting point.
Right. And let me ask another question related to that, because threat intelligence, how can that actually be used for organizations as a part of early detection and response mechanism? Can it be? And if yes, how? What would be your recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question, especially we already talked about ransomware. It's fascinating because so many customers come to me and they're concerned and they say, how can you detect ransomware? Well, a lot of times the victim's going to detect ransomware first, right? If you see your machine is ransomed, your files are encrypted, that's a pretty good indication. But what threat intelligence can help us do in the case of ransomware is try to detect those precursors. For example, I mentioned bizarre loader and bizarre backdoor. are precursors to ransomware. We know this. There are many families like this. CTI suggests that Qbots and other, malware families that sometimes people would dismiss as just criminal malware. They have led to other activity, often using Cobalt Strike for lateral movement, and then ultimately ransomware like Ryuk or other families like Conti. And so that's where CTI can be so helpful, because without that knowledge of, hey, Bazaar leads to ransomware, you might see, a phishing email come in with Bazaar and you're like, oh, okay, no worries, we'll get to that later. No, based on CTI and researchers around the community, you might have minutes, and if you're lucky, hours to respond to Bazaar before it turns into a potential ransomware attack.
Right, that's really fantastic because I think one of the keys that we will see going forward is not just using preventive controls to be better defending ourselves against the cyber attacks, but also how we're using the capabilities to detect early and to respond early to cyber attacks. Which brings me to the next question, which is about some bit about the unknown threats. Because I mean, obviously, there are a lot of researchers who are and a lot of information out there about the known threats and the ones that need to be patched. But what about the other threats that either are not, there is no patch available yet, or the ones that are completely unknown? How do you better defend yourselves against these unknown threats?
The phrase unknown unknowns is a common one in intelligence. And I think that while we have to be concerned about what we don't know, there's so much we already know about what threat actors do in networks. And I have the MITRE ATT&CK matrix behind me. One way to think about MITRE ATT&CK, this collection of tactics, techniques, and procedures, is like, there are tripwires around every technique. And even if adversaries might operate a little bit differently, maybe the exact procedure they use is unknown, adversaries like to use the same behaviors over and over. And so if you think of MITRE ATT&CK, that matrix, as a tripwire, any time that an adversary lands in one of these techniques is a chance for us to catch them. And so there's this old idea that, adversaries only have to be right once, defenders have to be right every time, but I would flip that. Adversaries can't slip up at all. And so this is the idea of defense in depth, that maybe you don't catch them in their initial phish. Their phishing attachment evades your defenses, but then they get on a box, and there are only so many things in terms of an operating system that they do. And even if it's maybe a threat actor that we haven't tracked before, we know a lot of adversaries love PowerShell still. People say PowerShell is dead, not from where I sit. And so
Definitely
even
not.
if you're monitoring, I don't know if you've heard that too, kind of silly, but so if you're monitoring PowerShell script block logs, or lulbins, right, living off the land binaries, even if it's a slightly different adversary or procedure or variation, it's still a good chance that you're going to be able to catch them. And so I think it's all about defense in depth, always about knowing where you have coverage and where your gaps are. Are there certain parts of your network you don't monitor, or certain techniques you just can't see, and then constantly trying to fill those in.
Fantastic. And you mentioned also something there, which was about the behavior analytics. How do you think one can combine, and what is the potential benefit of combining that with the threat intelligence?
On my team, we very directly use threat intelligence to inform behavioral analytics. And we do this, for example, by looking at new threat reporting out there, looking at sandbox sites like AnyRun or many others, and observe, are there any unique strings or attributes that a certain malware family or threat are using in their behaviors? And any unique human fingerprint is a chance for us to try to detect that adversary. And so at a very narrow level, we can look for certain strings or unique registry keys or values to try to create an analytic. We can also create broader analytics. This is where red team research and CTI working with red teams is really important, because CTI analysts can understand what's on the cutting edge that researchers are finding that adversaries might be implementing, and then create analytics based on those newly discovered techniques and behaviors. And so, again, the other way CTI can help is by prioritizing, because if you look at all of MITRE ATT&CK, there are so many techniques, but by focusing on the techniques that adversaries that have targeted you have actually used, CTI analysts can help their defenders figure out, okay, here's where we should focus first on creating behavioral analytics, because it can certainly be overwhelming.
And despite the complexity of the digital landscape and also now the convergence of the digital and the physical and the biological and everything that's going on, we touched upon a bit that a lot of the attack vectors are still very like simple and easy, and phishing emails, they're not necessarily overtly complicated. And something that we know is the human component of it, which gets attacked quite a lot. How can cyber intelligence help there?
Security awareness programs are so important, and my friend Lance Spitzner has done some great work there. And I think CTI teams can provide input to security awareness training by giving real examples. I found it's so easy for users to ignore guidance. Don't click on links in emails or watch out for suspicious phishing emails. But when you give an example, here is a real example, I think that becomes so much more powerful. It's not just telling users what not to do, it's explaining to them why. And bringing users in and understanding a few of the threats behind the scenes, I think helps build support and understanding of it's not just this nebulous threat, this is actually a real thing that matters. So I think that's one way CTI can provide input into security awareness programs. And the other thing that I would say around, patching the human and exploiting the human is that user awareness training is only one piece of the puzzle. And I think this community overall really needs to stop victim blaming. It's so tough, especially, in these times. If someone gets a phishing email, click here for important HR meeting, they're fearing for losing their job, something like that. We need to have more empathy for those victims. And as cybersecurity professionals, we need to understand our threats enough. And that's where CTI comes in to not just educate users, but also think about how we can secure operating systems so that they can't be affected by these threats. How do we lock things down? How do we do things like disabling macros or implement application control software so that we can stop blaming users and work with them to secure our enterprises?
Fantastic. Such lovely conversations with you today, Katie. If you can recommend some reading or listening to our audience.
Absolutely. I have so many CTI books. The classic one I'd recommend is Psychology of Intelligence Analysis by Richard Hoyer. He is one of the grandfathers of this field, and I think it's so important for all of us to understand our cognitive biases as we are intelligence analysts. And so that's a great one. So many great resources out there, blog posts, my own blog post, Katie's 5 Cents. I have a bunch of CTI resources on there, and sources for anyone who's looking to get started in CTI. So those are my recommendations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie, for coming on the podcast show. It was lovely conversations with you today.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Monica.
That was today's episode of We Talk Cyber with Monica. I'll be back with more episodes, fantastic conversations, and amazing guests. So continue tuning in. Until then, take care.